All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elena Whitaker, and I'm a water and conservation educator with Iowa Learning Farms. Today we have with us Dr. Kelsey Fisher, talking about monarch butterfly biology, ecology, and conservation needs. Go ahead. Really quick. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll make sure there will be a time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. So with that, go ahead and take it away, Kelsey.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you guys. I recently relocated. So for the past 8 or so years, I was a PhD student and a postdoc with Steve Bradbury at Iowa State. And I just landed my first career job. So I'm now in Connecticut. I'm an assistant agricultural scientist too, with the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. But I'm really tied to Iowa and excited to continue to be able to have conversations about what's going on there. Okay, so and let's see if I can get it. There we go. Okay, so I figured I would start out with just some basics of monarch butterfly life cycle. Where a lot of people are really familiar with the monarch butterfly because of their annual migration that goes from Mexico up to Canada. So right now, all the monarch butterflies are overwintering in. Oh shoot, I was muted that whole time. I'm so sorry. So I just wanted to say,
Kelsey. I just accidentally muted you. You're good.
oh, okay, good. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so you can see in the bottom left of my slide here that the monarchs overwinter in Mexico all huddled together, and then they undergo a multi-generational migration northward. So over the generations, the monarch butterflies travel north. We start to see monarch butterfly adults in Iowa in about June, sometimes as early as May. And then they continue on their life cycle where they have eggs, and then the eggs hatch, and we have larvae which feed on milkweed specifically, and then the larvae form a chrysalis. The chrysalis becomes an adult. And the last generation of monarch butterflies comes out, and they're a little bit different. They migrate all the way south back down to Mexico, where they are currently residing. So because the monarchs can overwinter all huddled together, we have this really great opportunity to be able to approximate population size. And there we go. Okay, so for the past over 2 decades now, we have been estimating how much space the monarch butterflies are taking up in Mexico. And because they try to huddle as close together, we know that they're always going to be huddled nice and tight. So how much space they take up means more space is more butterflies. And so since 1994, we've been able to get approximations of how big the area is that the monarchs are overwintering. And we can see that there is a decline in the overwintering numbers. And it's there's many reasons for the monarch butterfly decline, but one of the ones that in Iowa we have most control over is that the monarch butterfly decline is associated with the loss of milkweed, with the introduction of glyphosate resistant crops. And it's estimated in 2017 that the area of the Midwest had about 1.6 billion stems of milkweed, and that 1.6 of milkweed is approximated to support 3.2 hectares of overwintering monarchs. In order to have a stable population, we've approximated that we'd like to have 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs overwintering in Mexico, which then means that we would need to establish an additional 1.3 billion stems of milkweed in this dark purple region on the map, which completely includes Iowa. And through the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium and other groups like the Fish and Wildlife Service, Iowa has been deemed responsible for establishing approximately 150 million stems of milkweed. And that's a heck of a lot of milkweed. Okay, so when I first arrived in Iowa back in 2016, all of these conversations were just starting. And the biggest thing that we were kind of trying to figure out was, well, that's a heck of a lot of milkweed. Where should we be strategically planting this milkweed? And so the Iowa Monarch Working Group at Iowa State was born, where we do research to try to provide evidence-based biologically informed strategies for monarch butterfly conservation that work with agriculture production. So we would never propose to take land that is profitable and productive out of production and put in monarch habitat. We say, how can we work with what's going on in the landscape already and help the monarchs and also help the farmers? So this group of over 30 collaborators from lots of different backgrounds come together, and we perform lots of different basic research projects that our research projects inform other research projects, and we go back and forth to try and come up with some applications and strategies that would be useful for farmers in Iowa. So helping the farmers and helping the butterflies. So some basic biology things we need to think about with the monarch butterfly when we see it in the summer, which is the breeding season, is that monarch butterflies are highly mobile. If you see monarchs on your property, it's very likely that those butterflies will not be staying on your property very long. They fly around a lot, and they tend to just kind of spread out over the whole landscape. So here's an example of a typical Iowa roadside that has corn on one side and soybean on the other, and roadside ditches that look pretty much like they're grass. And there might be some other stuff in there, but there's not a ton of milkweed. Some roadsides have more milkweed than this, but let's just use this as an example. So you have butterflies flying around, and hypothetically, there's one milkweed rammet on the roadside. Those monarchs are going to find that milkweed, and they're going to be able to lay their eggs on that host plant. But the question is, how did that butterfly find that milkweed? And where is that butterfly going to go next? But then also, what happens while the butterfly is there on that milkweed? And also what happens for the caterpillar? And so the basic part of my research that I was working on while I was at Iowa State is how to get there, where will it go next, and what happens while it's there, both for the butterfly and for the caterpillar. And by understanding things like this, we can come up with applications and strategies that would help us identify where to establish habitat that will strategically increase, one, the number of eggs that monarch females lay over the summer, and two, the survival of those caterpillars. So by laying more eggs and having more caterpillars survive to adulthood, we're producing more adults overall. So I'm going to go through two examples of research projects that I worked on over the past few years, and to identify these biologically informed recommendations. So how can we increase the number of eggs laid by each female, and how can we increase survival? So I'll talk about both of these separately. So first, how can we increase the number of eggs that are laid by breeding season females? So like I said earlier, the monarch butterfly is highly mobile. So it's not going to stay in your backyard. If you have a ton of milkweed on your property, that's wonderful and fantastic, but individual butterflies will only lay a few eggs on your property. They're not going to stay there for their whole lifespan. They're going to continue to move around the landscape. So hypothetically, let's say your property is the one that I have circled here in yellow, and you have beautiful milkweed and nectar resources for all the monarch butterflies. We know that the butterflies are going to leave that property, but we know also that wherever there's red in this map, there's beautiful milkweed and nectar resources and wonderful things for monarch butterflies. So what's going to happen is the butterfly is going to leave your property that's circled, and it's going to undergo most likely what's called a random walk, meaning that the butterfly is just going to kind of go in any random direction until it picks up some type of cue that there's other milkweed and nectar resources in the landscape. But the question is, how long is it going to take for those butterflies to find the next property? And how much energy are these butterflies wasting while they're looking for that property? So if we build it, they will come, but how long will it take and how much energy is it going to cost us? So what would be great is if we could understand how the butterflies are moving through the landscape so that we could create something called functional connectivity, which pretty much just means stepping stones through the environment so that the monarchs can move with direction from one habitat to another. And by creating functional connectivity, we're able to decrease the amount of time that the butterflies are searching for the next milkweed or nectar resource. And by decreasing the search time, we'll ultimately be increasing the number of eggs. So while I talk about this research project, I'm going to use a few terms, one of them being perceptual distance. This is the distance that a stimuli will influence the behavior of a butterfly. The next one is step length. This is just the distance between two locations. And the final is turn angle. And this is the angle created for movement. So for example, a step length could be the black line in the functional connectivity that's labeled 75 or 47 meters. And then a turn angle would be the angle created with this red habitat, the orange habitat, and then the next red habitat. Okay. So it would be really fantastic if we understood how the butterflies are moving and how we could create functional connectivity. However, at a landscape scale, this including multiple properties, insect movement and dispersal studies are really limited because insects are small and we just don't necessarily have the ability to track them over large spaces. So before I started at Iowa State, a postdoc named Tyler Grant was working on a spatially explicit agent-based model, which pretty much is just a video game where we have the Iowa landscape in the background. You plop some monarch butterflies into the landscape, you give them some parameters, and they move through that landscape based on those parameters. So specifically, the parameters that were being used to have the monarchs move through the landscape were the three I just talked about: perceptual distance, step length, and directionality, which is the same thing as turn angle. So in Tyler's model, he was messing with the different values that we could use for perception distance and for directionality. And we were keeping step length constant at 50 meters, just to make things a little easier. And in these pictures here, A, B, and C, you can see that based on the different parameter values, so this would be a short perceptual distance and high directionality, meaning that the butterflies, A is the one I'm talking about, the butterflies can only see and smell for a short distance, and they move in very straight lines to get to it. The amount of space this yellow path is taking up is much different than the amount of space that's taken up by the monarchs moving with a long perceptual ability and high directionality, meaning that they can see and smell really far away from them and they move in straight lines. And so when I got here, I was looking at these pictures and I was like, well, how do we know which ones are representative of real movement? So I decided to use very high frequency radio telemetry to try and figure out if we could understand which parameters were the most representative of what butterflies are really doing. So I have this little transmitter that emits a radio frequency that we attach to the underside of the monarch's abdomen, and we release butterflies, and then we're able to track them down again with an antenna, a receiver, and a very highly trained technician or operator that's able to find these butterflies again. So over the course of 2016 to 2020, we conducted tons and tons and tons of studies. We put transmitters on butterflies and released them in all different types of landscapes. And we were able to track them for about an hour, and then we would take the transmitter off one butterfly, put it on the next butterfly, and do it all over again. So I was able to accumulate tons of data. So this picture here is just an example of one butterfly's flight path that was taken through a restored prairie, but we did this for lots of butterflies in lots of different places. And based on all of our observations that we were able to perform while we were doing our research, we approximate that the monarch butterfly's perceptual ability might be about 125 meters, but that might be on the high end because most often we were seeing stimuli at about 50 meters or less influencing behavior. The step lengths were typically small. They were typically less than 50 meters, but we did notice that the length of the steps that butterflies were taking were related to if they were in a prairie or if they were on a roadside or if they were over a cornfield. So when monarchs were within prairie habitat, they were taking short steps to hop from one resource to the next. But when they were within a place that didn't have anything for them to feed on or anywhere for them to lay eggs, then they were taking long steps to get out of that area faster. And turn angle kind of did the same thing. So when butterflies were in places like prairies, they were turning around a lot so they could hop from one place to another, versus when they were in a place that didn't have very much for them, they were just moving in straight lines. So those images that we were showing of Tyler's model, rather than it always being one parameter, it kind of is dependent on what land cover they're flying over. And then also with turn angle, that we learned that the overall the butterfly's movement was highly linked to the wind direction. So they either flew into the wind if they were looking for resources, or if they were trying to cover a lot of ground, they would fly with the wind and be taken, so they didn't have to perform as much flying with their muscles. They could just coast along with the wind. And overall, with all of this information, even more evidence that the monarch butterflies are vagal, meaning highly mobile. We were able to put transmitters and track butterflies over, we saw them fly over 500 meters over a crop field and then land in a restored. And we saw them cross habitat edges all the time. And some of the steps that the butterflies were taking from one location to another were about 2 kilometers away, which is really, really big distances. So summarizing all of these results together, the recommendation that I can provide is that it would be really fantastic if we could establish habitat patches every 50 meters within agricultural landscapes, because those tend to be the distance where the resources are able to most influence butterfly movement. But because of these other things that butterflies are doing, like taking these huge steps over crop fields, edges, and it's okay if it's not perfect. It would be great if it could be every 50 meters, but just getting habitat in the ground will be good too, because there's other things that the butterflies can do to find it. So then next, like I said before, we were taking this information and putting it into Tyler's model, and together we created a manuscript that was just published in Bioscience, and it's the cover image, and it's like this really big, wonderful thing that shows how we can take modeling and empirical studies and put them together to come up with bigger answers. Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is now that we can understand how to get the monarch to move, we can facilitate the movement of monarchs across the landscape, they're going to be laying more eggs. Now, how can we get those eggs to survive to adulthood? So how can we increase larval survival? So I said it in the beginning, but I just want to make sure that it's very clear. Monarch larvae feed on milkweed. Monarch butterflies lay eggs on milkweed. So milkweed is very, very, very important for the monarch butterfly life cycle. Interestingly, though, this is common milkweed, and you guys have probably seen it at some point. And it's not evenly distributed across the landscape. Sometimes we'll have these really big patches of milkweed, and other times we'll see isolated stems of milkweed. The other thing that's interesting with that is that monarchs are not using these evenly to lay eggs. So in these big patches of milkweed, if you survey them, you might find 3 to 10 eggs in one patch. But also, if you have an isolated milkweed stem, you might find 3 to 10 eggs on one stem. So that's very interesting. And it led to the question of, can one stem support larval development for one caterpillar, let alone up to 10? It seems like that might not be the case. Because caterpillars, we all have read The Very Hungry Caterpillar. We know that they need to eat a lot. Of this was to understand if one plant could provide enough food for one caterpillar to survive from egg to adult. And we observed something really interesting where the caterpillar was provided just one stem of milkweed, and we watched them every day. And we started to see the caterpillars on the side of the cage instead of on the milkweed. And we know caterpillars are hungry, they need to eat. So why are they on the side of the cage instead of on the milkweed? Which then led to a bigger study where we put one caterpillar with either 2 stems of milkweed, 3 stems of milkweed, or 4 stems of milkweed to see if the caterpillar was just looking for a new stem of milkweed, and we were now going to provide it. And we started to see the same thing after they reached, so caterpillars grow incrementally. And so once they reached their fourth instar, meaning the fourth developmental stage of a caterpillar, they were on the side of the cage or the pyramid, or they were looking for something different. And that's not the time when the caterpillars will pupate. Caterpillars pupate after the fifth instar instead of after the fourth instar. So these caterpillars still needed to eat more food. And so by doing this study, we found that the plant abandonment behavior, them leaving their natal plant, seems to be an innate behavior. It seems like all of the caterpillars are doing this for some reason, and we're not quite sure why. But we did see that the amount of food that one caterpillar needs is about the biomass provided by one milkweed stem. And so based off of this kind of weird observation that we saw, we have the recommendation that we should avoid isolated spermets or isolated stems of milkweed if possible. And it would be really great if we could maintain at least 3 milkweed stems in backyard gardens to increase larval survival. So I'm not recommending that if you have a prairie restoration on your property, you make sure that there's always 3 milkweeds close to each other, because that is totally impractical. But if you have the control over how many milkweed ramets are in your backyard or how many milkweed stems are in your backyard, if you could keep 3, that would be fantastic. And so just in conclusion, 2 really easy examples of how we can understanding monarch butterfly biology can help us with conservation. The first being that we could increase the number of eggs laid by females if we were to establish habitat patches every 50 meters, but it's okay if it's not perfect, because there's other behaviors that the monarchs do that they'll still be able to find other milkweed. And the second being, if you have control over it, maintaining at least 3 milkweed stems together in your backyard garden would increase larval survival, because it would ensure that the caterpillars, when they leave their first milkweed stem, they find something else that would be good for them to eat on. So I did not do any of this work by myself. There's a huge team of us that have been working on it together. And lots of funding sources. And so I wanted to leave lots and lots of time for questions and conversation. And so I think I can take any of those. So thank you very much.
All right, Kelsey, if you actually want to put up the slides for the CCA credits, I'll go through that really quick.
Right, I forgot, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and submit them then in the chat, and we will start answering those in a second. So for the CCA credits, if you would like CCA credits, email me at alenaw, alenaw@iastate.edu by today at 5 p.m. Include your name, your CCA number, and if you entered the webinar with a different name, include that as well. And then on the next slide, we have a voluntary demographic survey. We only need 1 response for all of 2023. So if you've watched multiple webinars in 2023, you are good, just 1 time. I'm also putting a link to the survey in the chat right now. Make sure it's to everyone in the meeting. There we go. And then lastly, our survey or our webinar for next week, if you want to flip the slide. Our webinar for next week is Climate Smart Agriculture and Crop Insurance, a 2023 update with Pamela Stahlke, who is the director for Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, based in the St. Paul office with USDA Risk Management Agency. So that'll be next week, same time at noon. All right, and with that, we do already have some questions. So first question, how do the movement patterns of male monarchs compare with that of female monarchs?
Okay, I may or may not have heard that whole question. Sorry, my internet is slightly unstable. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can see people's faces instead. It's much easier to talk when I can see somebody. Um, okay, so females and males are very different. The female butterflies tend to have more directed patterns where they're flying from one place specifically to another place, either if it's a milkweed or a nectar resource, or they're trying to find somewhere to rest for the evening, or any of those other things. The males are very, very drawn to finding females. So the females have all of the reproductive energy going on. So females are trying to stay safe and hidden. The males are the ones to get their reproductive energy out. And so they need to find females. Their goal is to mate with as many females as possible. And so the males will do what's called patrolling behavior, and they'll circle a prairie habitat or a resource patch or something, just hoping to get a female interested. So she'll fly up and mate with them and fly off and do their mating behaviors. So yes, males and females are very different. I should have said that my work was focusing specifically on the females, because we really wanted to see how we could get more eggs into the landscape. And we know that the males are going to be really successful at mating with the females. They're really good at it. And so just understanding how the females are moving to see if we could facilitate female movement. So yeah, that's a great question and a really great observation, because most of the time when you see butterflies circling around, it's mostly the males. The females hide pretty well.
This person has a question about one of your earlier slides, saying that 150 million milkweed stems is 7,500 acres. Is that solid milkweed acres, or is that pollinator habitat that includes milkweed?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting conundrum that the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium had to grapple with. All of the recommendations for monarch butterfly conservation talk about milkweed stems, and milkweed stems are it's not real. We know monarchs don't like the big patches of milkweed, because we saw that if there's an isolated rammet versus a patch of milkweed, you'll get the same number of eggs in both of those scenarios. So if we were to just plant fields of just milkweed and nothing else, they wouldn't be used the way that we might think that they would be, lay a few eggs in that big patch and then fly on. And so trying to understand what a stem estimate is into an acre estimate, there was a lot of math that was going into that, and a lot of experts providing opinions. And so we talk about stems, and then I put the acreage approximation. So that acre habitat. So not with milkweed, pollinator habitat with milkweed in it.
Did you consider pesticide exposure in generating these recommendations? And then if so, can you elaborate on that?
Yes, you are one step ahead of me. So I mentioned my work and I mentioned Tyler's work. There was also another part of this team. Her name is Naranjana Krishnan. She is a toxicologist, and she focused like 100% on pesticide exposure in monarchs. And the big takeaway with her work is that it's better to get habitat in the ground than to worry about potential threat of pesticide exposure, because nothing is at risk at all times, and there's a net gain in just getting habitat in the ground. So yes, we did consider all of that in this too.
All right, this next person says, so they're talking about how in the 1940s, milkweed pods were actually gathered by school children in Iowa I didn't know this, so lifesavers could be made for airmen and sailors during the war. But their question is, how do we get milkweed back into the Iowa landscape, especially because most farmers consider it to be invasive?
Yeah. So a big recommendation from the consortium is to plant pollinator habitat on places that are being underutilized. So if there's an area on your farm that you're mowing a lot, and it's really just there, it's just turf grass, or you're maybe storing some equipment there at some times of the year, that would be a good opportunity to put just a little patch of habitat onto your farm. Or if there's an area of your farm that's really hard to access, and maybe that could get put into like a CP42 practice, the Conservation Reserve Program, and the 42 is the pollinator habitat clause of that. So if there's some place that's just annoying to get to, maybe that would be a good place to put some habitat. Yeah, I know seed is definitely limiting, but there are resources for how to get seed. I know that the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium website has all kinds of places where you could access seed. And yeah, I know, like, so it's very interesting to hear about all the different things that the milkweed floss has been used for in the past. Milkweed is in a pod, and all of the seeds are attached to like a little fluffy bit. And there's actually, people have considered using that instead of down feathers in like coats and things as well. So it's really interesting to see all of the different things that could potentially be used with the milkweed. But yeah, the monarchs need the milkweed leaves. We need the milkweed leaves in the landscape.
Perfect. This next question is, they're wondering if riparian zone protections were put in place along the waterways, would it be enough space for milkweeds and then monarchs?
It's not enough space. Yeah, that was one of our biggest things. We were thinking about riparian areas, which maybe already have some milkweed and nectar in them. We also were talking about roadsides because that's public land that is underutilized and potentially could have milkweed and nectar. If you add all of that up, it's still not the acreage that we need in order to help the monarchs. So there's a really cool paper from 2017 that says it's an all hands on deck problem. We can't expect one group to solve the problem for everybody. We all need to be doing it together. And 100%, I would never advocate taking your highly productive land out of production. But if there's a place on your land that is either hard to get to, or you're always putting fertilizer on it because it's not quite productive enough, maybe those are some places to think about. Is there a different strategy you can use? So maybe pollinator habitat could be a place.
All right. This next question is actually the same question I had. Does it matter what type of milkweed?
Okay, so there was another grad I overlapped with for a little bit, and that was like the question of her research was, what is best milkweed for monarchs? And by best, we mean able to support get the biggest butterflies. So the caterpillars feed on the milkweed and then they make really big butterflies. And in the insect world, bigger is better. And so we want big butterflies. And so feeding them all the same amount of food and that kind of thing. And then also looking at which milkweed species get the most eggs. And we are very, very lucky because it turns out she looked at, I think, 9 different species of milkweed. It turns out the 3 that are commercially available are the 3 best. So we have common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, and swamp milkweed. And so we are just very lucky. They do really great on the ones that we can purchase.
That's really exciting. Has there been any research done on what serves as the best habitat for the monarchs to hang their chrysalis? And then what is their ideal spot?
That's fascinating. We would have to be able to find them to know that. I don't know if anybody in the audience has tried to look for monarch chrysalises. It's not an easy thing. Usually you just run into them so I've seen a lot on deck port, like the porch railing on a deck. I'll find some chrysalises there. I find them on like signs if you're in so if there's a prairie restoration and there's a sign that says like what the prairie restoration is and who funded it and all those kind of things, I'll find them on the bottom of that sometimes. We do not know. We just know that the monarchs need to get away from their milkweed for the most part because it's protection. They're really vulnerable for about 2 weeks in that chrysalis. And so they're trying to get away from any evidence that they were around. So we can't find them. I wish we could. It would be fascinating. I would love to learn more about that. But yeah, they just find places that are good.
All right, this next question. What are your thoughts on developing monarch habitat on the side of I-35? The person says, it seems like a corridor that follows the migration, but it also seems like a good place for a butterfly to get hit by a windshield by a car.
Yes. Yes, I tend to agree, but we don't really know the whole story. I think that it's really great. So you have to balance it, right? Like, so we need to get habitat out, and the I-35 corridor is definitely not going to be enough land to do it. But there's all those lovely signs that say that they're doing monarch butterfly conservation on the I-35 corridor, so it gets the word out. And yes, maybe some butterflies are going to get hit by cars. Hopefully, they're producing more butterflies than they are getting hit by cars, and hopefully, a lot of the land. Hopefully people are able to see that as a practice, and that the state is doing something to try and help the monarchs, and then everybody else can kind of take the lead from that on places that are more on gravel roadsides or less accessible by the streets and things like that. So I understand the potential. That sounds like a really terrible idea, but it's really visible to the public, and I think that is really great. So so it's one of those, I don't know what the right thing is, but I think it's good, generally speaking, because people are able to ask about it.
This next question, they're wondering if you could share your thoughts on the importance of outreach efforts and using Habitally as a way for all to contribute to understanding of habitat locations.
Yes, Habitally. Yes, so Habitally is an app that allows people that have established pollinator habitat or monarch habitat, well, specifically monarch habitat, so that your acres get counted. If you are in some type of CP program or something like that, your acres are already counted because you are you're a part of the big program, and so we know how many acres are in CP program. If you of your own generosity decide to establish a monarch habitat on your property, we need to know that so that we know where we are in our goal for the 7,500,000 acres we need to establish. And so Habitally, Habitally, I believe, it's habitat with tally in it, so that we can count the habitat. So it's an app, and it asks you to provide some pretty vague geographic information. It's not, you don't have to put in your full address. Maybe I think you do it at a county level, and how much habitat is there. And there we go. Thank you. And yeah, so we need that. We definitely need that. This past year, we had our first report for how many acres we were getting, and it's surprising how far behind we think that the urban area is. And it might be because people are not reporting the pollinator habitats that are being established. So yes, reporting the habitat is very important. Yeah. But if it's already in some type of program, then it's already counted. So if you have land in CP42, then you wouldn't need to report that.
Okay, another question is, so the habitats tend to get patches of milkweeds based on how the seeds spread. Do you suggest that people try to thin these areas to reduce the number of stems?
No. If it's your backyard and you're planting it because you're having a beautiful, like you're doing beautification and like landscaping, then yeah, if you can, it would be reasonable. I would never want somebody to go out and thin out some of the patchy areas, because it happens over time. So the big patches, they'll come and they'll go as the years go on, and you'll see that the big patches start to migrate through your habitat. And sometimes it's like, oh, there was a lot of milkweed there last year, I wonder why there's not so much this year. And it's just variation. It just happens from year to year. And if you have control over it. So I think the biggest part of this is sometimes people would come to me and say, oh, I helped the monarch. I have one stem of milkweed. And that's when it was kind of a, okay, what is the one stem enough? Do we need to have, like, can we establish milkweed in their habitat or in their property that would support the life cycle of the monarch? Can we understand what's going on with this butterfly so that we can do the best we can where we have control? If you're planting seed and you're throwing it out in like a big acreage, just let it do its thing. I think that would be good.
All right. This next person says, going back to your map where you had like all the purple areas showing about the different stems needed, they live in central Nebraska and they were wondering, do the other areas also have a number to match like Iowa's? And then where would they find those numbers?
They should have a number. I, at this current moment, do not have the answer to that question, but I can find the answer to that question and I can pass it along to you if that's all right. And then
yeah, we can include it in our webinar blog recap, so then it can be put on there for people to see. So
okay.
And then the next question. What do adult butterflies eat? Are there certain flowers that are preferred nectar resources?
Wonderful. Yeah, that was another project I did. The most that I saw monarchs feeding on. Okay, so monarch adults feed on nectar. So similar things that you would be planting for bees are good for monarchs. So part of we were curious too, what do monarchs feed on most frequently? So the preferred thing is milkweed flowers. So we saw them feed a lot on common milkweed flowers and a lot on butterfly milkweed flowers. After that, may or may not like the answer, but thistles seemed to support a lot of monarch butterfly foraging. The Canada thistle, the musk thistle, we saw lots of feeding on those. Monarchs like some clovers. There's actually, we just got a paper accepted for publication where we did an analysis of this. So the biggest is definitely the milkweed, but those only flower for a certain amount of time. And then shoot, I don't have it in front of me, but this is something else I can send and you can put it in your blog recap for the other nectar resources that the monarchs like.
All right, and it looks like we have one last question here. I'll give you a second so you can finish making your
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I get the information to you guys that you're asking for.
Yes. So have you seen the study on the various milkweeds and the potency of the chemical in the milk to protect them? The person can't remember the name. It was maybe a carotenoid. That study showed that butterfly milkweed had the least beneficial chemical for protection. And their experience showed that butterflies prefer common and swamp over butterfly milkweed.
Okay. Yeah. So I think you're probably talking about the cardenolides in the milkweed. And yes, there's been lots of studies that show that there are different levels of cardenolides in the different milkweeds, and the monarchs tend to kind of have a sweet spot. So you want there to be some cardenolides, but you don't want there to be too much cardenolide. Because if it's too they usually sequester cardenolides and then use it for their own protection against herbivore or against like birds and things like that. But if you have something that's too little, then they're not really getting that protection either. So I am not totally certain the exact study you're talking about, but yes, that's definitely a thing to be aware of. I don't know if it's something that we necessarily need to do anything about, because it's kind of just nature and it's doing its thing. But it's really cool. So that's a really nice observation.
All right, we did get a couple more come in. So, is it good or bad for school children to raise monarchs in their classrooms at school? And
Wow, you guys are like hitting all the questions. This is really awesome. I say it's good because it is an educational opportunity for those students to become familiar with nature and to see like the awesome metamorphosis that happens from egg to crystalline to adult. I would say maybe don't do it a ton because we want the butterflies to be able to we want the butterfly population to recover naturally without us intervening with what's going on. I definitely think that it is something that should be observed by every kid ever, because I think that it really has a chance for kids to interact with nature and to form some appreciation for it, because this is crazy, right? Like the caterpillar turning into a chrysalis, turning into a butterfly is absolutely insane. And it's really cool to watch. But I think that the biggest thing to do is to establish milkweed outside, because that way the butterflies have a chance to recover naturally rather than having to rely on us, I guess.
All right, one last question, then we'll wrap things up here. So they say milkweed is very important, but what about food needs during the fall migration? And then how does the lack of pollen and nectar in August and September affect their overall survival?
Awesome. Wow, you guys are very well informed. This is phenomenal and very interesting. This has been a lot of fun. Yeah, so the monarchs need nectar to fuel the fall migration. And so those fall nectar resources are really important. Like the goldenrods and the frost asters and other things like that are really boneset, I think, is one of the other ones that was popular. Yeah, so those were other ones that were popular in my study too. Sorry, I'm now like remembering the things that were asked earlier. And so yeah, we really need to fuel that migration, because if they don't have enough energy to get them all the way to Mexico, they're not going to make it. So that was a really awesome point. I don't think that I know much more about the pollen and things like that and how they work into fueling the migration, but I just know that we need to get those late blooming species out there too, and the early blooming ones as well. It's easy to get the mid-season ones because one, that's milkweed, but then also you have lots of other things that bloom during that time period, and I feel like a lot of seed mixes focus on that. But I think it's important to make sure that when you are coming up with a seed mix, you have species that bloom from early spring to late fall. And the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium website has a seed mix recommendation. And so, and they have links to how to get seed and where to go for that too. So yeah, good point.
All right, perfect. Well, that is all the questions that were in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I've learned a lot. And so again, will be recorded and will be on the ILF website. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely. And we'll talk again soon.